Hello and welcome to our podcast.
We are Echoes of History.
And today we'll be discussing the Second Industrial Revolution. This period of industrialization was a time of rapid technological, economic, and social change. The major transition from handmade goods to machine-based production led to urbanization, new industries, and global economic transformation.
In this episode of our podcast, we'll be covering the technological advancements, consequences, and the reactions to the industrial global economy of the Second Industrial Revolution.
Let's get started. The whole deal with the Second Industrial Revolution was the development of new technologies and advancements. For example, things like chemicals, steel, and even electricity.
Okay, so why those things specifically? Why are they important?
Well, the significance of these advancements in steel, chemical, and electricity was that they completely transformed how things were produced and how people got from place to place. For example, steel production. Henry Bessemer's Bessemer process made steel cheaper, stronger, and more accessible, which made producing steel easier and therefore completely changing infrastructure. So, without these advancements, major projects like the Eiffel Tower and the Transcontinental Railroad in the U.S. would not have been possible. The chemical industry was another industry that advanced significantly, especially in Germany, where synthetic dyes, fertilizers, and explosives were developed. Inventions like the Bayer process helped mass-produce aluminum, as well as German chemist Fritz Habert's work with ammonia revolutionized agriculture by making fertilizers more efficient, which increased crop yields. Electricity changed the trajectory of pretty much everything during this period. With the invention of the light bulb, factories were able to operate for longer hours, which increased productivity. Nikola Tesla's innovations in alternating current meant electricity could travel over long distances, which made electrification of entire towns possible. Electric streetcars and subways also resulted from this, which helped to transform urban transportation and made cities more connected than ever. These developments weren't just about making things faster, but they transformed entire global economies as well as everyday life.
Wow, that's pretty interesting information. Without those advancements, society wouldn't have been able to be where it is today. Speaking of transportation, advancements in transportation as well as communication were extremely important during the time of the Second Industrial Revolution, specifically how advancements such as railroads, steamships, and telegraphs affected internal and external migrations during the 19th century.
What do you mean by internal and external migrations? How could railroads and steamships have impacted that?
Before railroads and steamships, transportation was significantly slower, costly, and dangerous. On land, people relied on horses, wagons, or walking, often traveling through harsh, unpredictable terrain. Crossing the ocean was even worse. Migrants spent months in overcrowded ships with world diseases. Only those with financial means or extreme determination could afford to migrate. Railroads and steamships completely changed this in the 19th century. Travel that once took weeks or months became faster, cheaper, and easier. Railroads connected rural areas to industrial cities like Manchester and Chicago. In the U.S., the Transcontinental Railroad made westward expansion much easier. At the same time, steamships transformed global migration by replacing unpredictable sailing ships. Europeans were able to cross the Atlantic in weeks instead of months, while Chinese and Indian workers migrated to the U.S., Southeast Asia, and the Caribbean. Internally, railroads fueled urbanization and westward expansion, while externally, steamships enabled mass transoceanic migration.
Oh, that makes more sense. So, transportation made traveling faster, cheaper, and more accessible.
Yes, that's exactly it.
Well, what about industrialization in other countries? Do you think it would have some similarities or just overall different?
I'm not sure. You guys have any thoughts?
Well, to make a comparison between the United States and Russia, their efforts in industrialization were very different. The U.S. followed a capitalist, market-driven approach fueled by innovation and private industry, while Russia, especially under Soviet rule, pushed rapid state-controlled industrial growth. The U.S. focused on consumer goods and infrastructure, whereas Russia prioritized heavy industry and military power. Both saw massive growth but at different costs. Russia's approach led to inefficiencies and shortages, while the U.S. dealt with monopolies and labor struggles. In the end, one thrived on competition, the other on central planning, with very different long-term results.
So, when you compare the US and Russia's path to industrialization, they went in pretty different directions. But were their efforts successful?
It's true that some historians do debate if whether the US and Russia's industrialization efforts were successful. The US experienced momentous economic growth, developing into a global industrial powerhouse, but that came with major downsides. Huge wealth gaps, harsh working conditions, and the calamity/exploitation of labor, especially of child workers. On the other hand, Russia industrialized incredibly fast, especially under Soviet rule, but it was heavily state-controlled. That led to inefficiencies, shortages of consumer goods, and an economy that couldn't sustain itself long-term. So while both nations industrialized, the success of their methods is still up for debate.
Latin America had their own industrialization process too.
Really, I haven't heard much about Latin America during the Industrial Revolution.
So when we look at industrialization in Latin America, it was pretty slow and difficult. A lot of countries wanted to modernize their economy, but there's a big issue: political instability. With all the revolution and constant changes in leadership, it was really hard to make long-term plans. On top of that, Latin American countries were really dependent on foreign markets. European and US businesses invested in lucrative regions, but they mostly focused on extracting resources like silver, copper, coffee, and sugar, rather than helping to develop a local industry. As a result, most of the profits left the region instead of being invested in things like factories or infrastructure. That said, some countries did make progress. For example, Argentina managed to build a strong meat packaging and grain processing industry, helped by new railroads that made trade easier. Mexico, under Porfirio Diaz, saw growth in factories and infrastructure, though his rule was pretty harsh. Now, Brazil started to build a textile industry, but many landowners there resisted change, sticking to their profitable coffee exports instead.
Well, with all this physical change, with transportation, communication, and production, people had to also change as well, right?
Yes, that is most likely true, but what do you mean by change?
I think what Iman means is that, similar to the Enlightenment age, people started reacting to the things that were going on, and through this coming up with new ideas for the industrial processes that were occurring. For example, socialism and capitalism were two major competing ideologies during this time. Capitalism is an economic system where businesses and resources are privately owned, and competition in a free market determines prices, wages, and production. Socialism, on the other hand, is based on the idea that the government or community should control major industries to ensure economic equality and social welfare. In the 18th and 19th centuries, capitalism fueled rapid industrial growth, but it also created major problems for workers. With government regulation being used sparingly, factory owners like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller were able to create massive fortunes, while others faced things like low wages, long working hours, and dangerous working conditions. This political cartoon can be used as a primary source to represent how capitalism made it difficult for the working class to compete in the market. Child labor was also common, as well as overcrowding in cities and unsanitary living conditions, which made life even harder for the working class. In response to this, socialism emerged as a way to fight economic inequality. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in the Communist Manifesto refuted against capitalism and argued that capitalism created a class struggle between factory owners and workers. They believed capitalism prioritized profit over people and called for workers to rise up and take control of production in order to create a classless society. While large communist revolutions did not happen right away, socialist ideas led to major labor movements.
Interesting. So, from the Industrial Revolution, new ideas began to emerge? That brings up the topic of the labor movements of the 19th century, because as the industrialization process started to progress, more workers were needed in factories, but they didn't always have safe or fair working conditions. Honestly, working back then was brutal. We're talking 12 to 16-hour shifts a day, 6 days a week, in dangerous, dirty factories, all for barely enough pay to survive. Workers will often lament their exhaustion and suffering as there was no safety regulations, no protections, and if you got injured on the job, that was your problem. Naturally, workers started to push back. They wanted better wages, shorter hours, and safer conditions. Child labor was also a big issue, so getting laws to protect kids from working in factories was another major goal. To make change happen, workers had to organize. Strikes were one of the biggest tools. They walk off the job, shutting down factories to force employers to negotiate. Protests, rallies, and labor unions also played a huge role. A lot of strikes turned violent, with companies bringing in strike bearers or even getting the police involved. While many of these efforts were met with resistance, sometimes even violent crackdowns, labor movements eventually won significant victories, like shorter workdays, higher wages, and workplace safety laws, laying the foundation for workers' rights today. This primary source from the Mueller v. Oregon case, 1908, ties right into the labor movement in the 19th century and the fight for better working conditions. It marked progress in recognizing women's rights, thanks to the growing push for fair treatment in the workplace.
I see the connection between the two ideologies and how that turmoil influenced workers of the Industrial Revolution to fight for their rights.
Going back to European industrialization, we know that Britain was the first to industrialize, and we compared how the US, Russia, and Latin America industrialized.
The only states we haven't talked about is the Asian states and how they might have reacted to the industrialization process in Europe.
Exactly.
Tell us about it.
While Europe was rapidly industrializing, Asian states like the Ottoman Empire and King China had very different reactions. The Ottomans attempted limited reforms, like the Tanzimat, to modernize their economy and military, but internal resistance and financial struggles slowed progress. Meanwhile, the king resisted industrialization for much of the 19th century, sticking to traditional systems and underestimating Western advancement. This left them vulnerable to foreign influence as seen in the Opium Wars. Ultimately, both empires struggled to keep up, leading to internal decline and increased pressure from the industrialized powers.
That makes a lot of sense. Resisting industrialization really put the Ottoman Empire and King China at a disadvantage, especially when they had to compete with rapidly modernizing Western nations. It seems like their hesitation ended up making them more vulnerable to foreign influence and control.
Exactly. Industrialization didn't just change economies, it reshaped global power. Some nations thrived while others struggled to keep up.
Exactly. The Second Industrial Revolution reshaped the world with new technology, transportation, and industrial growth, but it also brought harsh working conditions and economic inequality. These struggles sparked labor movements that shaped modern workers' rights, while different nations experienced industrialization in unique ways. It wasn't just about the machines, it was about people, ideas, and global change. Thanks for joining us on Echoes of History. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.